Hi everyone, Six String Supplies. Welcome to our first video of 2018. It's been a good 2 months or so since our previous video. So Happy New Year first and foremost to everyone and anyone. Basically, since our last video, we've had quite a few questions, emails, messages asking how to do this, how to wire that, for example. So today we're going to be doing a quick video. I say quick, but it could go on guitar wiring 101, introduction, 1 or 2 basic skills, a couple of techniques, answering the questions such as how to ground, how to solder braided wire to the back of a CTS pot. We get that one a lot, so we're going to cover that. Basic equipment, tinning, how to do a bit of tinning your wires, tinning the terminals on switches and things, why you should tin, and what else? Grounding volume controls. Pretty much every volume control in every guitar you have to ground one of the terminals, so we'll be covering that. And also an overview of the equipment that gets used. A couple of essentials, a couple of not so essential bits of equipment that you could consider getting yourself if you do a lot of soldering. That's about it really. So we're going to start off with a quick overview of the gear that's used into wiring one of our pre-wired kits, for example, and then we'll move on to some mini tutorials. This is my workbench, various bits of equipment and wires on there, so I'll just go through each of them briefly, but not too brief as to whiz past them. Right, so basically everything I do, every kit or bit of soldering, I'm obviously going to be using my soldering iron, my solder station. Now this is obviously fairly upmarket, cost a fair bob, and I managed to get it on the cheap in the Black Friday sales a couple of months ago. To be fair, I do solder every single day of the week, pretty much, with the occasional day off. So for me it's a worthy investment. It's adjustable temperature. You can obviously get a much cheaper version, and I did have one, which I bought from Maplin's. It cost me £55 and I got well over a year's worth of use out of it, so that paid for itself quite quickly. But then again, it's not essential that you get a temperature adjustable one, it's just a lot easier. Typical, excuse my arm there, you got a sponge here which I've actually never used, but generally you want to use a damp sponge to clean your tip, or £2 each on eBay. Get these, I think you even get the little pot with it. As you can see, I've also got some in there. These do need replacing because they're starting to fill up, but these are brass shavings, which you can use that as a tip cleaner instead. What are the advantages of it? Well, it's not wet for a start, so it doesn't, albeit very temporarily, it doesn't reduce the temperature of your tip as a damp sponge would. And generally I just find it cleans a lot better. So I've been using them for quite some time now. I would recommend those if you do a lot of soldering. Obviously I've got soldering wire. I've recently, this is by far the best lead-free solder I've ever used, hands down. You cannot beat it. The reason for that though, let's see if you can read that. There you go. It's got a fairly high silver content. So if you do go lead-free, make sure it's got silver in it, because lead-free without silver is very, very hard to use, and it will even make a seasoned professional look a bit amateur. Obviously, if you're working on your home projects, I have to use lead-free because I'm selling these products commercially. But if you're working on your own stuff, just get something like this. It's tin lead solder, far easier to work with, and if I had the choice, I would be using leaded solder myself. Which leads me on to the next bit of gear. Fan, desktop fan from Maplin's, costs £5.99. It's a USB which goes into the plug obviously. There's a extension lead down there. That's quite simply just to blow the fans, the solder fumes away from your face, because even if you're using lead-free, you certainly do not want to be inhaling lead. That's going to lead to your demise. But even if you are using lead-free, it's still fairly nasty to inhale. So I've got a fan there to blow the fumes out of the way. And got one of these cheapo face masks just to stop me breathing it. Obviously, if you're only doing a one-off job every now and then at home, you definitely don't need the fan. I would recommend that mask, regardless, because I think it's a couple of quid from B&Q. You get me in a pack of 2. So I'll just turn that off because that's whizzing around. Got a multimeter, mainly very useful, but mainly just for tests for continuity. It helps diagnose problems, check all your connections are working. And you can also use it to measure the resistance of pots, which for every one of our pre-wired kits and most of the unassembled wiring kits that we sell on the website, we just check the pot values to make sure there's nothing extravagant going on there. But our latest pots, which I will discuss in a future video, are now they're made to a tolerance of 10%. So you'll find I find myself measuring pot values less and less. Here we've got some tinned copper, not essential by any means. Excuse me. Very useful for ground wire. I use it a lot for doing toggle switches. Obviously Les Paul wiring. Les Paul wiring kits. Again, that came off eBay, but we do obviously sell it on the website should you need a smaller amount. Right, in terms of the tools. I've got some small snippers here. Again, Maplins. I'm not promoting Maplins, by the way. I live around the corner, so I get a lot of my stuff from there. I've got a couple of wire cutters. Now these ones are to get into the nook and cranny of the small areas, especially if you've got a fully wired kit, you want to get in there. So I use those. A couple of pokies, mainly to hold wires in place. I'll go into those a bit more later. Got a couple of those. Here this is a multi-tool, but I only actually ever use the wire strippers at the bottom there, just to strip wire. Wire itself, various cloth wires there. I do have a fair amount more in the cupboard below. It doesn't matter if you're using cloth wire or PVC coated wire. Wire is wire. I find the cloth wire a lot easier to work with. And the other thing you do need to bear in mind, if you are using plastic coated wire, if your temperature's too hot on the iron, or if you're holding it there for too long, you can actually melt that plastic into the strands of the copper, which you don't really want. What else? Oh yeah, the biggie. Templates. I'll just move that there. Various templates. Fenders were designed geniusly, really, to be able to take them apart to make changes and modifications when required. So hence why the neck is bolt-on, and all the electronics are done onto a scratch plate or pick guard, which you can just remove your strings and then change them from there. So various templates, obviously. If you are doing it on a Gibson or Les Paul, for example, you don't want to be doing that inside the guitar. Make yourself a template, just trace through the holes from the control cavity onto a bit of paper or a bit of cardboard, and then transfer that onto something a bit sturdier. So I've got acrylic here, or that's a bit of plywood from Homebase. There you go, that's about it really. So we're going to move on to a couple of guitar wiring 101 and basic techniques. Right, so we're going to start off with tinning. The whole principle of tinning is to make the final connection, your final solder joint, a lot easier. So you should always tin the two things that are going to be soldered together. So it doesn't matter if it's your terminal or the wire. You want to try and tin both of them before you make your connection. You also need to keep your soldering tip tinned, because the key to soldering is heat transfer. So if you're not, if you haven't got a clean, nice and shiny solder tip, you're going to struggle to make a very good joint. So what do I mean by tinning? Here's my solder tip, here's my solder. Just giving it a nice coat all the way around, and then wiping off the excess. There you go. Now in terms of tinning your components, you only want a light coat of solder, but I'll show you if I turn it this way. Now this is a standard CTS pot, it's going to be my volume control. So the way I like to do it is to hold my soldering tip behind the terminal that's being tinned and just lightly flow, like you're drawing around the circle, your solder from the other side. And that works because the heat generated, transferred from this tip to there, is hot enough for my solder to melt from the other side. If you're wondering what temperature, bear in mind this is lead-free silver solder. My solder station is set to 395. If you're using leaded, you could get away with, well, as low as 335, 340. So I'm just holding it behind and flowing it on from the other side. There you go. Now if I'm tinning my wire, it's exactly the same principle. I'm just I'm doing this a bit makeshift bodge because I don't have my clamps. So there you go, nicely tinned. You just want to heat the wire and flow a little bit of solder into the stranded core. Now in terms of tinning the back of CTS pots, this is highly recommended because CTS pots, well, not CTS, pots generally require more heat on their back casing than you would do for connecting two wires to terminals, for example. So I'm holding, if I turn it around this way, I'm going to hold my soldering tip onto the required area, let it heat up for a bit, flow in your solder, spread it around a tiny bit. There you go. There's a little puddle of solder there. So when I apply my ground wire, I'm obviously going to put it into that puddle there, and we'll take it from there. And likewise, oh excuse me, if you're doing a switch on a Strat, it's exactly the same principle. Let's see if I can get the camera in. So soldering iron behind the terminal, or the lug, whatever you want to call it, and then flowing my solder from the other side. And flow it on that way. So that's your introduction to tinning. So every time I do a Strat, for example, every time you wire up something, spend a good 5 minutes following your wiring diagram and just start tinning the terminals and the connections that you know are going to need a solder joint, and it just makes it a lot easier. So for now, when I thread my wire through, let's assume this is coming from the pickup. If I thread that in there, turn it around so you get a better view. So that's my braided wire coming from my pickup. Let's call it the neck pickup, and this is the neck control. It literally takes a tiny amount of heat, and you don't have to flow in much solder to complete that connection. There you go. And this is why I have these tiny wires here, wire cutters, just to trim the end. So that's the advantage of tinning. Okay, so on every volume control in your guitar, you have to ground this terminal here. There are two ways of doing this. Probably the easier way, which I won't do but I will demonstrate, is to take a little snippet of wire, generally use tinned copper, or use some cloth wire and remove the cloth, it doesn't matter. And then you have the wire going between the terminal and the pot casing, and you obviously solder that into place there, and you ground it to the back of the pot there. But the way I do it, another way of doing it, which avoids using wire, so if you fill the terminal with solder, let that cool, and then we're going to bend this terminal back onto the pot casing and solder that in place there. So we'll bend that back because it's not hot. Oh, yeah, it's still quite hot. So I bent that back. I'm just going to move this out of the way for now. That's a better view for you. I'm applying my soldering tip just behind that terminal. Just in there. I'm going to hold that in place, let that heat up the connection, which is going to be the edge of the pot casing just there. And I'm just going to flow in my solder gently. Let it flow. And that's nicely grounded. So if we turn it around, can you see that? There's a bridge of solder between the two. So that's how you do that. Next we're going to move on to your ground wire, how to solder to the back of CTS pots. And one question we do get asked a hell of a lot is grounding braided wire to the back of a pot, because it can be very fiddly. So we'll do that. Right, so moving on to ground wire now. In pretty much every guitar you need to ground your pots together. Well, not pretty much, in every guitar you need to ground your pots together. It's not so much an issue in a Telecaster because the control plate is metal, and therefore the components touching it are already connected to each other. Which is why you'll see a lot of Fenders that don't have a ground wire connecting the two pots together. Same in a Strat, if the whole thing is shielded, that aluminium shielding bit of tape that you get in there sometimes, I mean, if it's high quality it's fine, but generally they're all connected together anyway, which is why you'll see a lot of Strats with the aluminium grounding plate, which you can buy on the market. I think they're about £5-6, and using one of those you don't need to ground the pots together. But in a Les Paul, generally, yeah, you can get them with grounding plates, but generally you need to lay down your ground wire. So that's the podular solder we tinned earlier. That's obviously going to be on every single pot in your circuit. I'm going to hold my soldering iron down. I'm going to flow in my solder. Now this is where my tools come in handy. It's a brush in one end, which I've never used, but just use a screwdriver if you haven't got one of these. You want to hold that wire in place while you remove your soldering iron. Let it cool, don't blow on it, let it cool naturally. And there you go. That's how you lay down your ground wire, and obviously that wire is going to be running around to the other three pots in your Les Paul. So next we're going to move on how to solder braided wire to the back of the pots. This braided wire obviously comes from your pickup, or your toggle switch could be braided as well. So your toggle switch goes to the middle, your pickup goes to the input here, input, output. And a lot of people ask us this, how to do it. Have you got any special techniques? The answer is not really. However, I'll show you how we do it, or how I do it even. Obviously you want to keep your soldering tip nice and tin, so I'm just going to put a little bit of solder on there. Right. Now pull the braid back a little bit. You don't want that getting too close to the terminal there. That'll do nicely. A bit more. Okay. So bear in mind everything we've covered so far. Tinning is obviously going to be key here. So decide wherever you want the wire to go. Put a puddle of solder directly underneath it. Give it a good spread. And then again, you're going to be needing a screwdriver or something just to hold that wire down. But you get your... I've got a fine tip solder here, a fine solder tip here, a bit like a pencil, which does help. Okay, so I'm going to flow in, hold it to the side of the wire, flow in your solder, and it will start to creep up on the braid. Just going to move that back over a little bit. And then give your soldering tip a twist and spread it on the top there. That's nice and sturdy, and then do exactly the same from the other side. I do expect some seasoned professionals to slate this technique in the comments. Everyone's got their own way of doing it. This is what works for me. So same again, holding my soldering iron there, feeding in solder and spreading it onto the braid. Now this only works if you solder the back of the pot first, tin the pot first underneath, because the heat transfer between the soldering tip and the puddle is what flows it onto the braid. So there you go, nicely grounded, nice shiny joint, braided wire to the back of the pot. So that's obviously coming from your pickup, and you can do exactly the same from this terminal going to your toggle switch. Okay, that's that. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any comments or questions, critiques, by all means, leave them in the comment section below. If you have any requests for particular videos for next time, we are working on a few more tutorials at the moment. There's just a lot of editing that needs to be done and the odd reshoot. So thank you very, very much for watching. Have a good one.